Okay, so we're going to be talking about the endocrine system, but one of the things we're going to be doing it in the beginning is comparing it with something we'll be talking about in Unit 4, the nervous system. Right? And this is a picture of a dissected nervous system, right? You can see the brain, you can see the spinal cord going down the middle. This is kind of like your central processing unit, right? That's bringing in all the signals of the world and then putting out signals, right? You can see that, the brain and spinal cord are one big chunk in the middle of your body. And then you got all these wires, right, running out all over your body, right? These are innervating all your skeletal muscles and stuff like that, or glands and smooth muscle, and also bringing in information from all the receptors all over your body, right? But these wires, like they're just cabling, right? Bringing information to and fro the into the brain and back out. That's your nervous system, right? So if you look at this picture here, this is the skeleton, but he's got all these yellow wires all over him, all over the body, right? Penetrating every little centimeter of your body. But if you look at the other way we control our body, right? So the nervous system is controlling all your skeletal muscles, your gross movements, as well as a lot of your internal organs, right? So, and it's doing it by these wires, direct connections with these wires, right? All over your body. And when you look at the endocrine system, right, it's much more limited, right? There's a couple little key organs or cells within organs, right, that are going to mediate their effects all around the body, right? And so it isn't widespread like the nervous system. It's very discrete, couple of locations, at least for the big ones. But the key is that it is connected to the whole cardiovascular system, so that when it does release its products, these little glands, right, they're able to travel all over the body. Right, so this is going to be the two different ways your body is controlled, regulating, all the processes in your bodies, right? So what we'll talk about is the function, the overall functions of the endocrine system, endocrine glands. Who are they? What do they know? Whatever. What are they, right? What are they made out of, right? Kind of contrast this with the exocrine glands, for instance. And then we'll asking about how these hormones, right, get to their target cells. What do they do when they get to them? And then we'll talk a little bit about a very simple regulation system today. Next time we'll talk about the more overall regulation with the pituitary gland and hypothalamus. And that's what we'll be going over today. All right. So when you're looking at these two, nervous, endocrine system, nicely color-coded here. Right? There's some similarities. They're both acting together to coordinate the functions of all the body systems. They're both using some kind of mediators. Both of them are using some kind of chemical mediator to exert their effects. And they're going to do so by binding to specific receptors on their target cells. The nervous system, though, is going to act through nerve impulses, right? Electrical signals going through from one nerve cell to another along these axons of neurons. And when they connect together from one nerve cell to another, or a nerve cell to a target, it's going to transfer that information through what's called neurotransmitters. Right? And these are chemical mediators that might be very similar to hormones. In fact, sometimes they're the same thing. They're releasing these neurotransmitters in a very specific region called synapses for the most part, right? On the other hand, the endocrine system is going to control these body activities by releasing these hormones. And the hormones are going to be released in those specific glands or cells within a gland. And they're going to be entering the bloodstream, travel all around the body, and then regulate the activity of cells in all parts of the body, right? Regulate their target cells. And regulating the activity has a pretty wide range, right? Going to have widespread effects on these cells, right? So between the two, the secretion and spreading around of hormones is much slower than the fast-paced electrical, mostly electrical kind of signaling of the nervous system. But once they're released into the system, they're going to last longer, right? The nervous system could start and stop very quickly, its effect, whereas the endocrine system is going to release stuff in there. And it'll take a little while for that reaction to stop. One thing you could think of in this is when you get, let's say right now you were sitting there watching this and a bear walked through your door right there, and you'd be really scared, right? You'd be like screaming and everything. Your nervous system would like set out all these fight or flight responses in your body, right? And then you looked again and it was your significant other in a bear suit. And you were like, oh, that's okay. I don't have to be scared anymore. But your heart would still be pumping for a while, right? Because not only was your nervous system set off, your nervous system also kicked in to your endocrine system, into your adrenal glands, and sent adrenaline all over your body, which took a lot longer to kind of calm down, right? Same thing every time you get into a fight with somebody and you're angry for, hours after or something like that, because you're still all excited, right? So that's the two, responses. It takes a little slower to occur, but then it lasts longer. And then the nervous system is going to act on very specific, it's going to have very specific targets, right? And it won't go, any particular nerve cell is going to only have certain targets or glands, muscles or glands, whereas the influence of the endocrine system is going to go all over the body, and it's going to be doing, all types of body cells. Your nervous system is mostly working on muscle cells and glands, right? Whereas the endocrine system is working on every single cell in the body almost. All right, so these are your two, nervous and endocrine system. All right, and there's just a couple of bullet points for that. So just for some illustration purposes, right? This is your spinal cord. This red and purple dots right here are the motor neurons that are controlling your skeletal muscles. Their axons leave the spinal cord. So look at this red one here. It goes out into your arm or whatever. Then it splits off and it's going to innervate very individual muscle cells, right? In this case, it's showing this one red one is injuring this muscle fiber, and this muscle fiber. It's not having any effect on this one or this one, right? That's controlled by the purple motor neuron right here, right? So when this one activates, these muscles over here contract, these ones don't. This will have to be weighted for this one, right? So it's very specific, this activity, right? Because these these axons come out, they end up, right, at this area called the synapse, and the release of its chemical mediator, neurotransmitters, is going to this cell only and affecting only this cell, right? So it's very, very tightly controlled. It's signaling, right? It releases its stuff and then it just affects these. And this is, mind you, this is showing 3. This motor neuron could be controlling 3 muscle cells. It could be controlling 100. It could be controlling 1,000 muscle cells, but it's a limited amount. It's very specific toward its effects. And that's your, your muscles that make your whole body move. But your nervous system also has very specific effects on the smooth muscle and glands of your body, some of the same targets that we're going to see for the endocrine system as far as the effects go. Right, so all these are very specific, point-to-point wiring, right? They're going to have very specific control centers in the brain, and you're going to be able to follow that pathway all the way to very specific targets. So that's your nervous system. And when it activates, for the most part, let's say it wants to increase saliva production. In this case, it would decrease. Let's say it wants to, decrease saliva production in your salivary glands, right? It'll slow it down, and then once that signal stops, bam, right? You can start secreting saliva again. If it wants to increase your breathing rate, right, or your heart rate, it'll do that through those direct wiring, and once it stops, it's done, right? Your heart rate goes back to normal. On the other hand, sometimes it has a direct connection to this little organ right over here, this little gland that's sitting on top of the kidney, like a party hat right there. And then right, that little gland right there is your adrenal gland, right? So your neuron comes out, it targets a very specific group of cells in here, right? Releases its neurotransmitter, and then that that cell right there is going to release stuff into the surroundings, which is going to go into the blood, right? Now we're talking about the endocrine system, right? Because it's going to release this product into the blood, and then it's going to go all around the body right there and do whatever it does. All right, so, this cell is sitting in some tissue right here. There's some interstitial fluid, and there's going to be blood vessels running all the way through it, right? So when we're talking about these endocrine glands, right, they're going to be secreting their product into the blood, right? And remember we talked about these epithelial glands, right? And how you started out with this lining, the cells grew inward, and then they formed those, secretory cells that were secreting stuff. If that connection to the surface remained, it was an exocrine gland, right? It was secreting stuff out into this lumen, and then the stuff was going out onto whatever the lumen is, right? In the case of our endocrine glands, that connection to the surface was lost, and then that clump of cells that was secreting stuff became vascularized, heavily vascularized, so that when it secreted stuff, it had a very nearby and dense blood supply to do it, right? So those endocrine and exocrine glands, right? And for our purposes, we'll be talking about all about these endocrine glands today, right? So exocrine glands, right? Secreting stuff, they're going to be going out onto a surface, very local, right? They're not going to really traveling too much farther than where they're secreting stuff. Right? Stuff is going to be secreted into this space right here, and then it's going to go out a duct onto the surface, right? Whereas your endocrine glands, this clump of tissue right over here, is secreting stuff, and it's going to go right into, it's going to go into the interstitial fluid really, and then into the bloodstream. There, it will travel all the way around the body, right? And so whenever you run into an endocrine gland or endocrine type cells, any organ with a lot of endocrine cells, you're going to have a lot of blood vessels going through it. This is one reason, the pancreas, which is has major endocrine cells within it, is, you've heard of pancreatitis or pancreatic cancer. Its location is kind of hard to get to, number one, as far as surgery goes, if you wanted to remove a tumor. And the other thing is it's so heavily vascularized that it's really hard to operate on. So that's one of the reasons all these pancreatic diseases are very dangerous, right? Part of it is that heavy vascularization in it that's hard to separate from the rest of the body. Very integrated with everything. All right, so here's that pancreas that we're talking about. The pancreas is an organ, right, that has endocrine cells within it, right? It's not an endocrine gland itself. It has both an exocrine part of it and an endocrine part. So this exocrine part, right, there's the cells. This is secreting like digestive enzymes. They go into a duct, and then they go into these tubes, and then they go into the digestive system. And then they got these group of cells over here that are secreting stuff into these capillaries over here, right? And then they'll reach the bloodstream, right? So exocrine versus endocrine, just keep this in mind. Very local stuff going on with exocrine and into ducts, right? And onto surfaces. So here's another example. Let's just bring this home. Over here, these are representing some exocrine glands that are secreting stuff into the lumen of your digestive tube over here. Right? These would be those exocrine glands, where into this surface area, right? Whereas anything that would come by the endocrine gland is going to come through all these blood vessels through here, right? And then they come out the capillaries, and they can affect all these individual cells of the body all around here, right? So when we're talking about the vascularization, right, once you release something into the blood, right, you have access to the entire body, because obviously every part of your body, right, is going to be densely vascularized, right? Blood vessels everywhere, right? So your hormones that are secreted by these endocrine glands, they have access to the entire body. Right, so this, starts when we're talking about the endocrine system. We're talking about all those glands, right? Your thyroid glands, your pineal, your pituitary gland, your thyroid, all these unique or specific clumps of endocrine tissue, right? But also, there is things like your hypothalamus, right, which is part something else, which has some kind of neurosecretory functions in there and controls the pituitary gland, which means it controls the whole endocrine system. You also have, like I just mentioned, your pancreas, which has endocrine cells within it, right? And you also have your gonads, right? The ovary and the testes, which among their other reproductive functions, or part of the reproductive functions too, is to secrete estrogen and testosterone, right? So they're not, ovaries and testes aren't technically endocrine glands themselves, but they have endocrine cells within them that will function really as endocrine glands. And so that's your endocrine system. All these little groups of cells affecting the whole body. Right, so here's a couple examples: pineal, hypothalamus, all these types of glands all around the body. This is just some examples of the specific hormones that each gland or organ is going to secrete. They have a way to get to they have a particular target that each gland is reaching for. Sometimes they're very broad targets, sometimes they're very specific, and they have a very specific effect, right, on that organ, on their target tissue right there, right? So we're not going to go over every single one of these. I'll pick up a couple select ones to talk about next time. All right. So most of what we'll be talking about are these circulating hormones, right? Just like we talked about, an endocrine cell is going to secrete stuff into its surroundings. That's going to diffuse into the bloodstream. It's going to circulate around the bloodstream, and it's going to reach its particular target cells, right? There are also ones known as local hormones, right, that don't need to go into the bloodstream. They act locally, right? Some cells kind of act on themselves. They just spit out some endocrine stuff, and they might have a little effect on the cells around them, but they also have an effect on themselves, right? Seems kind of silly, but there's purposes for that, right? Probably self-regulation. You secrete a whole bunch of it. It may affect cells around it, but it also may want to tell you to stop, right, secreting that stuff, and this is the signal for it to stop. Other cells, these paracrine one, are just secreting it, and they are affecting nearby target cells within the same tissue, usually, or nearby right there. Good example of this is nitrous oxide released by those cells that line the blood vessels, the endothelial cells, which are going to relax the smooth muscle fibers that are surrounding the blood vessel, cause them to dilate, right? Which is going to decrease blood pressure, increase blood flow. So that could happen based on local signals. So that's just a couple examples, but mostly we'll just be talking about these circulating hormones today.